My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 70 years old, and the face that looks back at me from the bathroom mirror this morning is a map of a life lived for others. The lines around my eyes are not from laughter, but from 40 years of squinting into the future, trying to foresee and smooth over every possible obstacle in my son's path. The faint creases bracketing my mouth are not from a lifetime of smiles, but from a lifetime of biting back my own words, my own needs, my own truths. For 4 decades, my world did not spin on its own axis, propelled by its own passions. It revolved, with the relentless, demanding gravity of a captured moon, around my son, David. My life became a garden I tended for a single, magnificent, and voraciously hungry bloom. Every other plant, every potential shoot of my own wild, untamed ambition was meticulously pruned back, its nutrients diverted, its sunlight sacrificed. I did it willingly, you see. I called it love. Now, in the stark, unforgiving silence of my later years, I have other names for it. Before the gravitational pull of motherhood captured me, there was another Eleanor. A younger woman whose world was painted in shades of green and umber, who smelled perpetually of damp earth, chlorophyll, and the faint acidic tang of fixing agents used to preserve delicate specimens. My fingers, now softened and wrinkled from decades of dishwater, were once stained with soil and India ink, the nails permanently crescents of dark, rich loam. My dream was a quiet, intensely focused, and scholarly one. I was a botanist, but my passion wasn't for the showy, attention-grabbing blossoms of the world. I was a bryologist, a specialist in the planet's most ancient and overlooked pioneers, mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. To me, they were not just green fuzz on a rock. They were entire universes in miniature. I could lose hours, my knees damp from the forest floor, a loop pressed to my eye, exploring the intricate architecture of a single stem of E. polytrichum commune, its tiny leaves like a perfect, spiraling staircase. I saw cathedrals in the spore capsules of a pincushion moss, hanging forests in the delicate branching of a liverwort. They were the first to conquer the land, to breathe life into barren rock. They were resilient, patient, eternal. In their silent, persistent growth, I saw a reflection of the life I wanted for myself, a life of quiet discovery, of contributing something small but lasting to the world's great library of knowledge. My small apartment was a humid sanctuary, a testament to this passion. Terracotta pots and glass terrariums lined every available surface, fogging the windows with their constant, gentle respiration. Bookshelves overflowed not with novels, but with dense academic tomes. The Structure and Life of Bryophytes. The Moss Flora of Britain and Ireland, Gait Torshi. I had a grant application, typed and retyped until the letters were faint, for a coveted research position at the University of Edinburgh. Edinburgh. The name itself was a poem to me, a place of stone and mist and history, of rain-soaked gardens where ancient mosses clung to the castle walls. The acceptance letter for my PhD program was framed, not on a wall for others to see, but in the most private chamber of my heart. It was the blueprint for a life of purpose, a life that was mine. Then came the storm that was Richard, David's father. He was a visiting lecturer in the literature department, charming and brilliant, with a poet's eyes and a liar's tongue. He quoted Yeats and promised me the world, a whirlwind romance of wine-fueled debates in dusty pubs and long walks under a canopy of stars he could name, one by one. He made me feel, for a fleeting, intoxicating moment, like I was the most fascinating species he had ever discovered. He left for a temporary post in California, leaving behind a string of beautiful, empty promises, and me, alone, with a positive pregnancy test, and a heart full of a love that had nowhere to go. The moment I held David, a tiny, screaming, fiercely alive thing in my arms, the carefully drawn blueprint in my heart was torn to shreds. The world of silent, patient mosses was annihilated by the urgent, non-negotiable demands of a new human life. The clean, earthy smell of my apartment was replaced by the cloying sweetness of baby powder and the sour, inescapable scent of spit-up milk. My research books were pushed aside for parenting manuals with their cheerful, accusatory titles. The grant application was tucked into a box of Richard's forgotten letters, then moved to the attic during a desperate search for more space, and finally lost to the geology of discarded dreams. My vision of Edinburgh, of a life spent in misty academic reverence, became a faded postcard, a ghost of a life unlived, a phantom limb I would sometimes ache for in the dead of night. I told myself it was a noble trade, not a bitter sacrifice. I traded the silent companionship of ancient plants for the chaotic, beautiful symphony of a child's laughter. I traded the cool, hallowed halls of a university library for the sticky, crayon-strewn floors of a small, rented suburban home. To support us, I took a job that was the very antithesis of my passion. I became a receptionist at a local dental clinic. The work was sterile, predictable, a world of bleached white surfaces, the sharp, antiseptic scent of cloves and fluoride, and the ceaseless, polite drone of the telephone. "Good afternoon, Dr. Albright's office. Eleanor speaking. How may I help you?" That phrase became the mantra of my days, a rhythm that defined my waking hours for 42 years. No part of it nourished my soul, but it bought diapers and formula. It paid the rent. It nourished David. And in the exhausted, all-consuming love of those early years, that was enough. Every penny I saved, every extra shift I took covering for a sick colleague, was a brick in the foundation of his future. My life became a study in frugal alchemy, turning a meager receptionist's salary into the gold of opportunity for my son. I remember the year he became obsessed with soccer. The fees for the competitive travel league, the new cleats, the uniform. It all cost as much as my entire grocery budget for a month. I ate potato soup and toast for 30 days straight, telling David I was on a new health kick. I'd sit on the cold metal bleachers during his games, my stomach rumbling softly, a fierce secret pride warming me more than my threadbare coat as I watched him race across the field. His joy was my feast. When he was a teenager and needed a car to get to his first part-time job, a rusty but functional sedan that was an impossible dream for us, I didn't laugh or dismiss it. I took a second job. After my 8 hours of smiling politely at the dental clinic, I would go to a downtown office building and spend 4 hours cleaning toilets and emptying trash cans, my body aching with a fatigue so profound it felt like a physical illness. The smell of industrial bleach and quiet desperation clung to my hair and clothes, a coarse, invisible perfume of maternal devotion. David, smelling of teenage confidence and cheap cologne as he grabbed the keys, never knew. He just knew the sudden, exhilarating freedom of the open road. My sacrifices were invisible by design. They were the load-bearing walls of his childhood, the hidden plumbing that brought comfort and ease, while I dealt with the leaks and cracks in secret. I was the silent, tireless engine, humming in the background of his life. I darned his socks with thread that never quite matched. My old botany loop now used to see the tiny stitches. I typed his school papers late into the night, my own eyes burning with fatigue, correcting his grammar and marveling at a turn of phrase, feeling his academic success as if it were my own. I stayed up, feigning sleep on the sofa, listening to the slow, agonizing tick of the clock, until his key finally turned in the lock, long after his curfew, my body a repository for unspoken worry, a landscape etched with the fine lines of his crises. I thought he saw. Or, perhaps, more accurately, I desperately needed to believe he saw. I believed that somewhere, beneath the magnificent, necessary self-absorption of youth, he understood the sheer tonnage of my efforts. I saw my love as a savings account, an investment that would one day mature and pay dividends of companionship and care in my old age. So when he was accepted into a prestigious university, the kind of school a botanist from Edinburgh might have taught at, I didn't hesitate. I walked into the bank and cashed in the retirement savings I had so painstakingly accumulated over 30 years. The financial advisor, a kind man named Mr. Henderson, with concerned eyes, sat me down in his quiet office. He spread the papers before me, showing me the numbers in stark black and white. Eleanor, he said, his voice gentle but firm, this is everything you have. Cashing this out now, with the penalties. It will leave you with almost nothing for your own future. For your retirement. Entail, merci stay and try. I remember the feeling of absolute, unshakable conviction that filled me. I looked at him, a man who saw the world in assets and liabilities, and I pitied him for not understanding. David Viz, my future, I said, my voice clear and certain. This is the most important investment I will ever make. His success became my success, my vicarious life. His graduation felt like my own. His beautiful wedding to Amelia, a woman who came from a family of cool, effortless wealth, felt like my own crowning achievement. I liked Amelia at first. She was polished and ambitious, and she looked at David with an adoration that mirrored my own. I convinced myself that her sharp edges were just a sign of her strength. I helped pay for the deposit on their first luxury apartment, a gesture that required me to take out a small, high-interest loan I would be paying off for years. I hosted lavish family dinners in the small house I had finally, after a lifetime of scrimping, paid off, my one significant asset, my fortress of solitude. I poured my love, my time, my dwindling savings into the foundation of their new life together, believing I was investing in a shared future, a bond that would sustain me when I could no longer work. I imagined my retirement as a time of quiet, joyful reward. I pictured myself as the beloved matriarch, the anchor of the family. Sunday dinners at their large, elegant home, the sound of my grandchildren, their children, Lily and young Tom, laughing as they sprawled on an expensive rug. I saw myself not as a burden, but as a cherished, essential part of the family tapestry, the wise, loving woman whose sacrifices had finally blossomed into a magnificent garden for all to enjoy. I was a fool, a loving, devoted, spectacular fool. The garden I had envisioned was an illusion. The signs were there all along, of course, but I refused to see them. They were small weeds of indifference, which I diligently pulled, making excuses for their presence. The phone calls that went unanswered for days finally returned with a hurried, "Sorry, Mom, it's been a crazy week." The birthdays remembered with a text message, the emojis a cold substitute for a warm hug. The way Amelia would walk into my home, her eyes scanning the familiar, worn furniture. Each piece a story, a memory, with a faint, almost imperceptible air of condescending pity. She called my carefully tended garden, my riot of personal chaotic color, cluttered. She called my treasured botany books, the last vestiges of the other Eleanor, dusty. But I made excuses. He's busy with his career. She's adapting to being a mother. They have their own life. I trimmed back my expectations, just as I had once trimmed back my own dreams, to make more room for them. I did not understand that to them. I was not the gardener who had lovingly tended the prize bloom. I was merely the soil from which he had sprung. And once a flower is cut for display in a beautiful vase, it has no more use for the dirt. The event that finally shattered the carefully constructed glasshouse of my denial was, with an irony so cruel, it felt like a cosmic joke, a celebration in my honor. My retirement party. After 42 years at the dental clinic, 15,330 days of answering phones, scheduling root canals, and calming the jangled nerves of strangers, I was done. David, in a rare burst of what I mistook for filial enthusiasm, insisted that he and Amelia organize it. "We have to celebrate you, Mom," he chirped over the phone, his voice full of a warmth I hadn't heard in years. "You've done so much. You deserve a real party." The words were a balm to my weary, hopeful soul. I allowed myself to believe them. I allowed myself to hope. Amelia decided the party should be at my house. "It's more intimate, more you," she'd reasoned, her voice smooth as silk. "All those big impersonal venues are so tacky." In hindsight, I see the cruel, calculated practicality of her choice. It was easier for them, less to manage, and it centered the celebration in a place they already viewed with a kind of proprietary condescension. But at the time, I was touched. My home, my little world, would be the stage for my long-awaited acknowledgement. I spent a full week preparing, a flurry of activity that left my old bones aching but my heart full. It was a ritual, a final act of service before I could rest. I scrubbed floors until my knees were bruised, polishing the worn hardwood until it shone with a deep, honeyed luster. I polished the sterling silver flatware I had inherited from my own mother, pieces I only used on the most special of occasions. As I rubbed the tarnish from a teaspoon, I remembered using it to feed David his first solid foods, his tiny mouth a perfect AO of surprise. Each piece was a memory, a tangible link to a chain of love I believed was unbreakable. For 2 full days I cooked. The house swelled with the aromas of my devotion, a language of love she and David had long since stopped understanding. The scent of slow-braised beef with red wine and thyme filled every room. I made rosemary roasted potatoes, their edges perfectly crisp, and a large, bubbling dish of macaroni and cheese from scratch, because it was still David's guilty pleasure. And for the grand finale, I baked the apple pie that had been his favorite since childhood, using the recipe my grandmother had taught me. I crimped the edges of the crust with a diligence that bordered on prayer, believing that the taste of his own history might reawaken something in him, some memory of the boy who had relied on me for everything. I even bought a new dress, a foolish extravagance on my new, fixed income. It was a simple sheath of deep sapphire blue, the color of twilight. Standing before the mirror, pulling the cool fabric over my slightly stooped shoulders, I saw not a 70-year-old retiree, but a woman on the cusp of her reward. The fatigue in my eyes seemed to recede, replaced by a flicker of anticipation. A hope, bright and fragile and dangerous, ignited in the quiet stillness of my chest. The guests began to arrive precisely at 7, and with them, the atmosphere in my home began to curdle. They arrived in 2 distinct tribes. First came my people, a few loyal friends from the clinic, their faces kind and familiar, their gifts thoughtful and modest. A potted orchid, a book on gardening, a bottle of my favorite sherry. They moved through my home with ease, complimenting the food with genuine warmth. Then came the second tribe, David and Amelia's circle. They arrived in sleek, dark cars that lined my quiet suburban street, their presence an invasion of wealth and status. They were draped in casually expensive linen and smelled of complex, citrusy perfumes that battled with the homey scent of my cooking. They moved through my small, cozy rooms, like anthropologists studying a quaint, forgotten culture. Their compliments were barbs wrapped in velvet. How utterly charming, one woman with a severe black haircut said, running a manicured finger over a bookshelf filled with my botany texts. All these old books. Do you actually? I read him. David played the role of the gracious host, a role he had perfected. He poured wine that cost more per bottle than my new dress, his laughter a little too loud, his arm perpetually, possessively, around Amelia's slender waist. He was the successful son, showing off his charming origins before he returned to his real life. And Amelia was his queen, radiant and brittle, a diamond sparkling in a setting she found beneath her. She drifted through the party, bestowing fleeting, distracted smiles upon me, her mother-in-law, the guest of honor, the reason they were all there. I felt a growing, sickening sense of dislocation, as if I were a ghost at my own feast. I was a prop in their perfectly curated lives, introduced not as my mother, the brilliant woman who raised me single-handedly, but with a casual wave as my mom, Eleanor. Can you believe it? She just retired? I was a quaint anecdote, a footnote in my own story. The moment of immolation, the one that burned away the last of my illusions, came during the toasts. After a few of my colleagues shared warm, simple, heartfelt memories that made my eyes well up, Amelia stood, tapping a fork against her crystal champagne flute. Hush fell over the room. She looked beautiful, her expensive highlights catching the light, her smile practiced and dazzling. My heart swelled with a foolish, painful, maternal pride. This is it, I thought. Ani, acknowledgement. The validation for a lifetime of sacrifice. I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate David's mom, she began, her voice as smooth and cool as the champagne in her glass. "She's worked so hard her whole life, at her little job, and now she finally gets to rest. We're all so proud of her." The phrase, little job, was a tiny, sharp pinprick, but I ignored it, focusing on the proud. "We all wanted to get her something special," she continued, beaming at me. "Something to mark this new chapter, to keep her connected to us." She motioned to David, who placed a small, elegantly wrapped box on the coffee table in front of me. The guests cooed in anticipation. My hands, suddenly clumsy and trembling, fumbled with the perfect silk ribbon. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of pristine white satin, was a digital photo frame. I stared at it. It was a perfectly nice, expensive-looking gadget. But it was cold. Impersonal. It was the kind of gift an office gives a departing colleague they barely know, a generic gesture of feigned intimacy. "We've preloaded it with photos," Amelia explained, her voice bright and utterly oblivious to the gaping void that had just opened in my chest. "Hundreds of them. Pictures of us, the kids, our trip to Tuscany last year, David's promotion party. It's all on a loop, so you won't feel so alone now that you have all this free time. You won't feel so alone." The words, spoken with such casual, cheerful cruelty, landed like stones in the pit of my stomach. The implication was as clear as the glass screen of the device. My life was now officially over. It was an empty space, a void that could only be filled by watching a silent, looping slideshow of the life they were living, a life I had financed with my own, a life for which I was now merely a spectator from the cheap seats. A lump formed in my throat, thick and suffocating. It was the taste of my own irrelevance. My reward for a lifetime of sacrifice was not inclusion, but a screen to watch my exclusion on repeat. But that was not the final cut. The deepest, most septic wound was yet to come. In my foolish, hopeful heart, I had prepared a gift for them too. It felt like the right moment, a symbolic passing of a torch, a final attempt to bridge the canyon between us. With hands that felt numb, that still felt the phantom weight of their empty gift, I reached for a large, flat portfolio I had placed carefully by my armchair. "I have something for you too, darlings," I said, my voice a thin, unsteady thread in the suddenly quiet room. I untied the ribbons of the portfolio and opened it on my lap. Inside was not a single drawing, but a collection of 20. They were my botanical illustrations, the best I had ever done, rendered in painstaking, microscopic detail with professional-grade watercolor and ink. Mosses, ferns, rare, fragile orchids I had only ever seen in reference books. It was the secret work of the other Eleanor, the young woman who had dreamed of Edinburgh. It was the truest part of me. On the first page, in my neatest script, I had written, "Poor David and Amelia. So you will always remember the roots of the garden." It was, I thought, a piece of my soul. It was a desperate, final attempt to show them who I was, who I had been, before I had been reduced to simply Mom. I held it out to them. The room was quiet, expectant. Amelia took the portfolio, her brow furrowed in a mild, polite confusion. She opened it and flipped through the first few pages, her expression unreadable, her perfectly plucked eyebrows slightly raised. Then, a small, tight, dismissive smile touched her lips. She closed it, holding it with just the tips of her fingers, as if it were a strange and slightly distasteful craft project from a child. She turned to include her friends in the joke. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, her voice laced with a playful, patronizing affection that was more cruel than any shout could ever be. "Still with your little drawings. It's quaint. Ain't die. Adonrish." The word hung in the air, sharp and glittering and venomous. It was not an insult. It was an assassination. It was the same tone she might use for a child's clumsy macaroni art glued to a paper plate. It was a dismissal not just of the gift, but of the life, the passion, the identity, the lost career it represented. It reduced my entire being, my most secret and treasured self, my lost dreams, my very soul, to a trivial, old-fashioned, slightly embarrassing hobby. David, my son, the man for whom I had sacrificed my own forest of ambitions, chuckled beside her. It was a small sound, but it ripped through me like a gunshot. "Amelia, be nice," he said, but his eyes were laughing, seeking her approval. "We were hoping for something more practical. Maybe you could finally knit us that cashmere throw for the new sofa. We saw a gorgeous one at Restoration Hardware." A wave of laughter, polite but genuine, washed over the room. It was not a roar, but a soft, suffocating tide of amusement at my expense. In that moment, the floor beneath my feet seemed to dissolve into sand. The warm, fragrant air of my home became thin and cold, impossible to breathe. The smiling faces of the guests blurred, their teeth seeming to glint in the lamplight, their polite smiles twisting into grotesque masks of pity and condescension. I felt a profound, chillingly physical sensation of shrinking, of collapsing inward, of becoming smaller and smaller, until I was nothing but a speck of dust in the corner of my own life. A life they had just declared null and void. I don't remember what I said. I think I smiled, a rictus grin that felt like it was cracking the very bones of my face. I took the portfolio from her unresisting fingers and placed it on the floor beside my chair, as if it were a shameful object. The sound of their renewed chatter and laughter echoed in my ears, distorted and menacing, like sounds heard from underwater. I was drowning, in my own living room, in a sea of expensive champagne and casual cruelty. And my own daughter-in-law, the woman my son adored, was holding my head under the water, while my son, the lifeboat I had spent a lifetime building, just stood by and watched. The front door clicked shut, and the sound, usually so mundane, echoed with the brutal finality of a coffin lid being sealed. The party was over. All that remained was the wreckage, the silent, ugly aftermath of a battle I hadn't even known I was fighting. The living room, my sanctuary, was now a battlefield littered with the evidence of my defeat. Crumpled, wine-stained napkins like discarded battle flags, half-eaten slivers of my grandmother's apple pie congealing on dessert plates, the lingering spectral scent of Amelia's expensive, cloying perfume, an invasive spectral scent of Amelia's expensive, cloying perfume. But worse than the physical mess was the silence, a silence that wasn't empty. It was filled with the phantom echoes of their laughter, that soft, polite, soul-crushing ridicule, with my son, David, and his wife, Amelia, conducting the symphony of my obsolescence. I stood motionless in the center of the room for what felt like an eternity, the deep blue of my new dress feeling like a fresh, tender bruise against my skin. My gaze fell upon the portfolio of my botanical drawings. I had retrieved it from the floor after the last guest had departed, my movements stiff and automatic. I had not placed it back on the chair in a place of pride. Instead, I had slid it onto the bottom shelf of a bookcase, tucking it behind a thick, reassuringly solid volume on soil composition. It was a reflexive action, the instinct to hide a mortally wounded part of myself from view. The word Amelia had used, quaint, was not just a word. It was a perfectly shaped shard of glass, and with every beat of my heart, it worked its way deeper. It wasn't an insult born of fiery, passionate anger. It was so much worse. It was the casual, indifferent, thoughtless cruelty of a god swatting a fly. It was a judgment, passed down from a higher court of social standing and modern values, on my entire life, my secret, guarded passions, my very soul. And the verdict was trivial, insignificant, a relic to be pitied. Slowly, as if waking from a long and bewildering dream, I began to clean. My body, a machine programmed for domesticity over 7 decades, moved on an autopilot. My mind was somewhere else, adrift on a cold, dark sea of revelation. I gathered the delicate, long-stemmed wine glasses, the ones Amelia and David had insisted I buy for occasions just like this, calling my sturdy, practical ones clunky. As the warm, soapy water ran over my hands, each glass I washed became a bead on a rosary of bitter, clarifying memory. This one, with its faint ghostly print of Amelia's garnet red lipstick, was the down payment on their first condo in the city. I remembered the day I'd sat in Mr. Henderson's office, the same kind financial advisor, and signed the papers to liquidate the modest stock portfolio my own late husband, a quiet gentleman who had believed in my botanical dreams, had left me. It was the only tangible thing I had of him, besides a worn gold wedding band and a box of faded photographs. "Eleanor, are you sure?" Mr. Henderson had asked, his brow furrowed. "This is your security blanket." I can still feel the ghost of my own confident, foolish smile as I'd replied, "Investing in my son's happiness is my security." David and Amelia had sent a generic, pre-printed thank you card. There was a stock photo of a floral arrangement on the front. They hadn't even signed it themselves. This next glass, a heavy, solid tumbler that had held David's whiskey, was his final year at business school. The student loans were a mountain range he couldn't see a way across. He'd called me late one night, his voice tight with a panic he tried and failed to disguise as frustration. "I can't focus on my finals, Mom. This debt, it's a physical weight. It's suffocating me." That night, I hadn't slept. At 3 a.m, I had opened my mother's old jewelry box. I took out the string of pearls she wore at my wedding, the sapphire brooch that matched her eyes, the 2 simple gold bangles she never took off. The next morning, I had taken them to a pawn shop in a part of town I'd never visited before, a place that smelled of dust and desperation. The man behind the grated window had barely looked at me as he weighed the pieces of my heritage on a small, cruel scale. I walked out with a check that was a fraction of their monetary worth and none of their sentimental value. The weight of that check in my pocket was nothing compared to the sudden, crushing lightness on my wrist and collar, a nakedness that felt like a phantom limb. David had passed his exams with honors. He never asked where the money came from. He just accepted it, as he accepted all things from me, as his due. Plate after plate, I scraped away the remnants of the feast I had so lovingly prepared. The rosemary potatoes, their herby scent now a mockery, brought back the memory of 1,000 weeknight dinners I'd cooked for him as a boy. I saw him at the kitchen table, a mountain of homework before him, his face contorted in a struggle with algebra. I saw myself sitting beside him for hours, my own fatigue a distant, irrelevant hum beneath the fierce, focused light of my love. The apple pie, his childhood favorite, was a testament to the decades I had spent memorizing the intricate cartography of his small comforts. And for what? For him to stand by, a silent, smiling coward, while his wife dismantled my dignity, piece by loving piece? His silence was not neutrality, it was allegiance. In the face of her casual cruelty, his inaction was a ringing, deafening endorsement. He was holding the hammer while she drove the nail into my heart. I scrubbed at a stubborn dark red wine stain on the oak dining table, the table where I had helped him with that homework. The circular, repetitive motion of my arm felt like I was trying to erase more than just a stain. I was trying to scrub away 40 years of self-deception. 40 years of believing that sacrifice was a currency that could purchase love and loyalty. 40 years of thinking that my constant self-immolation would one day be recognized as a sacred fire, a beacon of maternal love. But they hadn't seen a sacred fire. They had only seen a utility, a furnace to be stoked for their own warmth. And now that the fuel, my energy, my money, my usefulness, was running low, they were looking for the thermostat to turn me off completely. My eyes fell upon the digital photo frame, their grand gift. It sat on the mantelpiece, its screen glowing with an obscene cheerfulness. A picture of them on a gondola in Venice appeared, Amelia's head thrown back in ecstatic laughter, David looking at her with an adoration I hadn't seen in his eyes for me in 30 years. Then it switched to a photo of my granddaughter Lily at her 5th birthday party, an event I was only told about after the fact. "Ah yes, so you won't feel so alone." The phrase echoed again in the silent kitchen, no longer a thoughtless sting, but a calculated act of psychological warfare. They weren't offering me a window into their life as an act of inclusion. They were giving me a screen, a prison wall, to remind me of exactly what I was not: young, wealthy, beautiful, relevant, and part of their exclusive, glittering world. It was a mirror that showed me not my own reflection, but my own absence. I dried the last dish, a small dessert plate, and placed it carefully in the cupboard. My hands, which had been trembling for hours, were suddenly still. A strange, glacial calm began to creep from my fingertips up into my arms, spreading through my chest, until it reached the frantic, wounded bird of my heart, encasing it in a protective, numbing layer of ice. The pain was still there, but it was distant now, trapped beneath the frozen surface. The hurt was crystallizing into something hard, clear, and unbreakable. Resolve. I looked around the silent, clean kitchen. My kitchen. In my house. And in that moment, in the sterile antiseptic quiet after the storm, a single simple thought rose to the surface of my mind, as clear and sharp and cold as the winter sky. It is over. It wasn't a thought born of rage or a theatrical desire for revenge. It was simpler and far more profound than that. It was the calm, final acceptance of a truth I had spent my entire life denying. My son, the son around which my own world had revolved, was a stranger who wore a familiar, beloved face. My love for him had been a monologue, delivered to a polite but empty theater. The Eleanor who existed for them, the doting, endlessly giving, slightly embarrassing, quaint mother, died that night. She bled out on the floor of her own living room, a casualty of a single well-aimed word. And as that Eleanor faded, another one began to stir from a long, deep hibernation. It was the botanist, the young woman who understood the ruthless, unsentimental laws of nature, the one who understood that some plants are parasitic. They vine themselves around a healthy, unsuspecting host. They sink their roots into the host's flesh, drawing nutrients and life, until the host weakens and withers, covered in the deceptive, suffocating beauty of the parasite's bloom. For 40 years, I had allowed it. In my blindness, I had mistaken the chokehold for an embrace. No more. That was when I thought of Lily, my granddaughter, David and Amelia's daughter. Lily was a miracle, a wildflower that had somehow sprouted and bloomed in the meticulously manicured, emotionally sterile lawn of their lives. Lily, who was 17. Lily, whose eyes, unlike her parents, didn't glaze over with boredom when I showed her the delicate veins on a fading maple leaf. Lily, who 2 summers ago had spent a whole week with me, not out of a sense of familial obligation, but because she genuinely wanted to. We had spent those long, sun-drenched hours in the garden, her hands, unlike her mother's perfectly manicured ones, plunged deep into the soil alongside mine. I had, with some trepidation, shown her the portfolio of botanical drawings, the very same one that had earned her mother's patronizing scorn. I remembered her reaction as if it were a film I could replay in my mind. She hadn't called them quaint. She hadn't offered a polite, empty compliment. She had sat on the grass, the portfolio spread across her lap, and had traced the delicate, inky lines of a maidenhair fern with a finger that was almost reverent. "Grandma," she had whispered, her voice full of a genuine, breathtaking wonder that felt like a healing balm on a wound I didn't even know was festering. "You day these? They're real. They look like they could breathe." She had then looked up at me, her young eyes, a startlingly clear shade of green, filled with a perception that belied her years. "This is who you are, isn't it?" she'd said. Underneath being a grandma. She saw me. In that one, simple, profound sentence, a 17-year-old girl had given me the recognition my own son had withheld for a lifetime. And that's when I remembered my secret weapon. It wasn't just a weapon. It was an insurance policy. Promise I had made to the botanist, to the other Eleanor, a contingency plan for a future I had prayed I would never need to face. 6 months ago, after another in a long series of casually canceled visits and forgotten promises from David and Amelia, a cold, unsettling premonition had settled deep in my gut. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I didn't make a scene. I didn't call to complain. I made an appointment. The next day I sat in the same lawyer's office where, years ago, I had signed papers to release funds for David. This time, the papers told a very different story. I remember the solid, reassuring weight of the pen in my hand. It was a quitclaim deed. A simple, powerful legal document that would transfer the ownership of my house. This house, my only real asset. The bedrock of my life, the fortress paid for with 42 years of bleached white work and lonely nights. From my name to another. The lawyer, a cautious, meticulous man named Mr. Davies, had looked at me over the top of his spectacles. "Eleanor, are you absolutely certain about this? This is irrevocable. Once you sign this, the house will no longer legally be yours. You would be transferring it into a trust with your granddaughter, Eleanor Vance, as the sole beneficiary, to be claimed upon her 18th birthday. Until then, you remain as the trustee with full control, but the ownership is, for all intents and purposes, legally transferred." "She turns 18 in 4 months, I had said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Is there a way to stipulate that the final transfer of control is not automatic on her birthday, that it must be actively triggered by a written instruction from me, the trustee?" Mr. Davies had nodded slowly, intrigued. "A specific activation clause. Yes, highly unusual, but legally sound. You would essentially be holding the final key to the safe. May I ask why you want this structured in such a way?" I had looked out his window at the busy city street below, at people hurrying to their own lives. "A failsafe," I'd murmured, more to myself than to him. "To protect the garden from a killing frost." I signed the papers. My hand did not shake. I had walked out of that office feeling not poorer, but lighter, as if a great weight had been shifted. I had planted a seed in secret, a hardy, resilient perennial that would lie dormant, waiting. It would bloom only when the killing frost finally came. Tonight, listening to the silence of my home, a silence still vibrating with the echoes of my family's laughter, I felt the air turn cold. The frost was here. The days following the party were cloaked in a new kind of silence. It was not the peaceful quiet of solitude I had looked forward to in my retirement, but the tense, airless silence of a sealed tomb. To my astonishment and growing dread, David and Amelia stayed. Their initial plan to stay for the weekend had stretched, unspoken and uninvited, into an indefinite occupation. They moved through my house not as guests, but with the languid, assured entitlement of conquering monarchs inspecting newly acquired territory. Their presence was a constant, low-grade fever in my own home, their expensive belongings colonizing my space. Amelia's yoga mat rolled up in my living room corner, David's laptop and work papers spread across my dining table. I found myself relegated to the periphery, a ghost in the machine of my own life, cooking and cleaning out of a deeply ingrained habit they mistook for continued, grateful devotion. We spoke, when we had to, in clipped, functional sentences about groceries and mail, the chasm of the party a silent, unacknowledged continent between us. The final act of degradation, the one that pushed me from passive resolve to active rebellion, came on a Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after the party. I was in the garden, on my knees, my hands plunged into the cool, dark soil. It was the one place I still felt a connection to the real Eleanor, the botanist. I was carefully transplanting a patch of shade-loving moss into a new terracotta pot. Amelia appeared at the back door, a mug of steaming coffee cradled in her perfectly manicured hands. She was dressed in expensive, cream-colored athletic wear, though the only exercise she ever seemed to do was jumping to conclusions and running other people's lives. "Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with a syrupy, manufactured condescension she probably thought sounded compassionate. "David and I have been talking. We've been doing a lot of thinking, actually." I did not turn around. I continued to methodically pull a stubborn, deep-rooted thistle from the base of a prize rose bush. Thorns bit into my fingers, but I barely felt it. "Have you?" I said, my voice flat. "This house is lovely, really," she continued, undeterred by my tone. "It has good bones, but it's an awful lot for one person to manage. All the dusting, the upkeep. And we've been thinking about our future, our investments. David's career is taking off. He's on the partner track. And we need a proper, dedicated home office. That little spare room you have is just impossible. The light is terrible. The light is terrible. I finally pushed myself up, my knees cracking in protest. I wiped my earthy hands on the front of my old stained apron. I looked at her perfectly coiffed blonde hair, her unlined, dissatisfied face, a face that had never known a day of real struggle. I said nothing. I just waited. And my yoga instructor is going fully remote, she went on, as if this were a matter of national importance. I need a space with the right energy, the right light, for my practice. A real wellness room, you know. She took a delicate sip of her coffee, her pinky finger extended. So, we have a solution. And honestly, it's perfect. It helps everyone. It's a win-win. My heart, the one I thought was now encased in an impenetrable glacier of ice, began a slow, heavy, ominous thud. I knew, with a sickening certainty, what was coming. We're going to turn your bedroom into the office. It has the best morning light, which is crucial for David's productivity. And we'll move you downstairs. To the basement. Vaguely. The word hung in the damp morning air between us, obscene and alien. Basement, died, My basement was not a finished, cozy den. It was a cellar. A place of cold, unforgiving concrete floors that sometimes seeped water after a heavy rain. A place of sweating, clanking pipes and a single, bare, fly-specked light bulb hanging from a cobweb-shrouded cord. It was where the hulking, groaning water heater rumbled like a caged beast, and where generations of spiders had built their sticky, silent empires. It was a place for storage, for forgotten Christmas decorations and rusty tools, for the dark, unseen foundations of the house. It was not a place for a human being. It was not a place for a mother. It was a place to put things you wanted out of sight. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, for her to laugh and say she was only joking. But her face was serene, pleased with her own brilliant, problem-solving magnanimity. She truly, genuinely believed this was a reasonable, even generous, suggestion. It's actually quite spacious down there when you clear out all that old junk, she added brightly, as if anticipating my protest. We'll put a nice area rug down, maybe a pretty folding screen for privacy. It'll be like your own little studio apartment, cozy. A rage, so pure and cold it felt like swallowing liquid nitrogen, flooded every cell in my body. It was a rage that threatened to burn through the ice around my heart and erupt. But I held it in. I had spent a lifetime swallowing my feelings. I was an expert at the bitter taste of it. The difference was, this time I was not swallowing them to make them disappear. I was metabolizing them into pure, high-octane fuel. And where is David in this perfect solution? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet, stripped of all emotion. As if on cue, my son appeared in the doorway behind her, a dish rag in his hand. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a spot on the lawn just to the left of my shoulder, his own shoulders hunched in a posture of familiar, practiced cowardice. He, the man whose education I had paid for with my mother's pearls, whose fevers I had soothed with cool cloths on my own sleepless nights, whose life I had built with the mortar of my own sacrificed dreams, could not even look at me as his wife sentenced me to the cellar. It just makes sense, Mom, he mumbled, his voice directed at the grass. Logistically, it's just for a while. Until we get properly settled and maybe look for a bigger place. It's a better use of the space. A better use of the space. I was no longer a person. I was no longer his mother. I was space. I was square footage to be optimized. An asset to be managed. The ice around my heart did not crack. It thickened, becoming a diamond. I looked from my son's averted gaze to my daughter-in-law's triumphant, expectant smile, and I gave a single, slow nod. All right, I said. Amelia's face flooded with a patronizing relief, thrilled that the old woman had been so reasonable, that she had avoided an unpleasant, emotional scene. "Oh, good. I knew you'd understand. We'll be a real team, the three of us. David can help you move your things down this afternoon." She turned and went back inside, victorious, probably to text her friends about how cleverly she was handling the mother-in-law situation. David lingered for a moment, still refusing to look at me, the dish rag twisting in his hands. "Thanks for being so understanding, Mom," he muttered, before scurrying back into the house after his wife, his master, like a well-trained dog. I stood alone in my garden, the garden I had created from nothing. I looked at my deep red roses, my billowy blue hydrangeas, the resilient ancient mosses growing in the cool shade by the fence. This was my world, my creation. And they thought they could just move me to the roots, into the dark, damp, unseen earth beneath it all. That afternoon, I did not protest. I sat in a hard-backed kitchen chair and watched as David, his face a mask of strained, false efficiency, carried my modest dresser, my reading chair, and my bed frame down the rickety wooden stairs into the basement. I watched him set up the artifacts of my life in a corner of the cold, concrete expanse. I watched as he unrolled the cheap, garishly floral rug Amelia had ordered online and had delivered that same day. I watched as he plugged in a small lamp that cast a lonely, jaundiced circle of light, a light that only seemed to make the surrounding darkness deeper. Each object he moved, each grunt of effort he made, was a separate, distinct act of betrayal. He was not just moving furniture. He was burying me alive. When he was done, he stood awkwardly at the bottom of the stairs, wiping sweat from his brow. "There," he said, his voice attempting a cheerfulness that was grotesque in its falsity. "It's not so bad, is it? We'll get it fixed up." I looked at the exposed pipes overhead, festooned with cobwebs like morbid decorations. I looked at the dark, spreading damp spot on the far wall, a cartography of decay. I looked at the single, high, grime-caked window that showed only a sliver of mud-caked sky. "It's fine, David," I said, and my voice was so devoid of emotion, so utterly empty, that it finally made him look at me. He flinched, physically flinched, at the vast, cold emptiness he saw in my eyes. "We'll have you back upstairs in no time," he lied, the words tasting like ash in the air between us. And then he fled, his footsteps quick on the stairs, desperate to escape the cold, uncomfortable truth of what he had done, to return to the warmth and light upstairs that he had stolen from me. I was alone. In the basement of the house I had paid for with my life. The air was cold and smelled of mildew and damp earth. But I did not feel defeated. I did not feel the hot sting of rage. I felt clarity. The absolute, diamond-hard clarity of a woman who had nothing left to lose and, therefore, nothing left to fear. They had made their move. They had put me in what they believed was my place. A place of irrelevance, of darkness, of foundations, meant to be built upon and then forgotten. They had no idea that from the foundation, you control the entire house. I sat on the edge of my bed, the cheap mattress sagging beneath my weight. I pulled my old, simple mobile phone from the pocket of my apron. My fingers were as steady as a surgeon's. There was no hesitation. I scrolled through my short list of contacts and found the name I was looking for, Lily. "Yes." She answered on the second ring, her bright young voice a sunbeam cutting through the tomb-like gloom. "Grandma, is everything okay? You never call on a weekday afternoon." "You, and yeah." "Hello, darling," I said, and I was amazed at how calm and steady my own voice was. It was the voice of the botanist, the woman of science. It was the voice of the CEO making a final executive decision. "Everything is perfectly fine." "Are you sure? You sound a little different, far away." "I'm just calling to tell you something," I said, looking around the dim, concrete room that was to be my new home. "Do you remember the conversation we had with Mr. Davies, the lawyer, about the failsafe we put in place for the garden?" There was a pause on the line. I could hear the quick, sharp intelligence in her silence, the gears turning. "The activation key," she said softly, her voice losing its cheerful innocence and gaining a new steely edge. Yes, I remember every word. Well, I said, taking a slow, deep breath of the musty subterranean air. It felt like I was breathing in power. The frost came. Another silence. Longer this time. I could picture her on the other end, her young face hardening, processing the metaphor, understanding all the terrible things I wasn't saying. I heard her take a sharp, angry breath. Grandma, what did they do? They gave me a new room with a view of the foundations, I said, a bitter, humorless smile touching my lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. It's very grounding. It's time, Lily. It is time to activate the trust. Okay, she said, and there was no hesitation, no doubt in her voice. There was only the fierce, protective love I had so desperately, foolishly wished for from my own son. Okay, Grandma. I'll call Mr. Davies' office first thing in the morning. The instructions for activation are in my name. They're already signed. I'll have the official notification letters sent by bonded courier tomorrow. Thank you, my dear, I said, my voice thick with an emotion that was not sadness but overwhelming gratitude. I love you, Grandma, she said, her voice a low, furious promise. I'll handle it. I love you too, Lily, more than you know, I replied, and ended the call. I placed the phone beside me on the bed. I did not cry. I did not pace the damp concrete floor. I sat in the center of my new subterranean world, in the quiet, damp dark. I was a seed, buried deep in the cold earth. And I waited, with the patient, silent, and absolute certainty of a root system that knows it is about to bring the whole, magnificent, ungrateful, sun-drenched garden crashing down. The storm was coming. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of it. I had summoned it myself. I spent the next morning in a state of suspended animation, a strange and profound calm settling over me. The basement, which had felt like a tomb the night before, a place of ultimate degradation, now felt like a cocoon, a command center. I was waiting. The air was cold, but I did not feel it. I tidied my small corner with a deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness. I folded the few clothes I had brought down, creating neat, sharp-edged rectangles. I sat on the edge of the bed, my back straight, and read a worn paperback copy of a book on alpine flowers, plants that thrive in the harshest, most unforgiving environments. The sound of David and Amelia moving about upstairs, the aggressive hum of her expensive electric toothbrush, the confident, self-important thud of David's footsteps on the floorboards above my head, the murmur of their voices as they planned their day, a day that revolved around them and their needs. It was all like a broadcast from a different, irrelevant world. It was a frequency I no longer tuned into. They were already ghosts, haunting a house that was no longer theirs. They just didn't know it yet. The doorbell rang at precisely 10:15 a.m. It wasn't the cheerful, two-note chime of a friend or a delivery person. It was a sharp, insistent, single-note buzz that seemed to vibrate through the very concrete of the house. A sound of official business. A sound of consequences arriving. From my subterranean listening post, I heard Amelia's brisk, annoyed footsteps approaching the front door. I heard the click of the lock, the squeak of the door opening, and a brief professional murmur of a male voice, followed by Amelia's clipped, dismissive reply. Then, the sound of the door closing again, harder this time, with a thud of irritation. There was a pause. A silence so profound it seemed to pull all the air from the house, a vacuum of normalcy before the storm broke. Then, I heard the sound of tearing paper. It wasn't a neat, careful tear, but a sharp, violent, ragged rip, as if the envelope had personally offended her. It was followed by a sound I will never forget as long as I live. It was a strangled gasp, a sound caught somewhere between disbelief and fury that escalated into a shriek that was pure, undiluted rage. David. The name was not a call. It was a summons. It was an accusation. It was a detonation. I heard his heavier footsteps hurrying from the kitchen, the scrape of a chair, a note of alarm in his voice. What is it, honey? What's wrong? Did someone hit the car? What's wrong? Amelia's voice was a razor blade, stripped of all its silky, condescending charm. This is what's wrong. Get in here right now and read this. Read what your quaint, pathetic, senile mother has done to us. I remained seated on my bed, my book open in my lap, my finger marking the page on Gentiana vernal, the spring gentian, a flower known for its resilience. My heart was beating a slow, steady, powerful rhythm, like a drumbeat accompanying a great, unfolding drama. I could picture the scene upstairs with the perfect, dispassionate clarity of an uninvolved observer. Amelia, her face a mask of apoplectic, blotchy rage, her knuckles white as she thrust the sheaf of papers at him. David, his face clouding with a familiar, boyish confusion, taking them from her. The rustle of the thick, legal-grade paper as his eyes scanned the first page. His reaction was different from hers. Not a shriek, but a low, guttural sound of utter disbelief, the sound of a man whose reality has just been unwritten. No, this can't be right. There's a mistake. It must be a typo. Some kind of legal scam. New sign. Oh, it's no mistake, David. Amelia's voice was climbing in pitch, teetering on the jagged edge of hysteria. She let out a laugh, a sound like breaking glass. It's a quitclaim deed, signed, dated, and notarized 6 months ago. The house, Gore House, the house we were going to sell in a few years and use the profits to buy our dream home, was transferred into an irrevocable trust. And do you know who the sole beneficiary is? Do you have any idea? Her voice broke on a wave of furious, incredulous laughter. Lily, your daughter. Our 17-year-old daughter owns the $100,000 asset we are standing in. And your mother, the woman you just moved into the cellar, is the trustee with sole, absolute, and final authority. It's all here, in cold, legal, ironclad print. We have 30 days to vacate the premises. No, young. 30 days. Praise, so clinical, so final, so utterly devoid of sentiment, seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the air upstairs. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on their future. Vacate? David's voice was faint, thin, the voice of a man who had just been punched in the stomach. No, Dot. She wouldn't. Mom wouldn't do that to me. To us. Wouldn't she? Amelia hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. Where do you think she is right now? She's down there in the dungeon you put her in, laughing at us. The old fool, the old witch, has been playing us this whole time. The thunder of their combined footsteps on the rickety basement stairs was like an avalanche, a clumsy, panicked descent. The flimsy wooden door, the one that didn't even have a proper lock, was thrown open with such force that it slammed against the concrete wall, the wood shuddering in protest. They stood there, framed in the doorway, panting slightly, their faces contorted with a primal mixture of rage and panic. Amelia's was pale and blotchy beneath her expensive makeup, her carefully constructed mask of serene superiority shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. David just looked lost. The confident, successful businessman was gone, replaced by a frightened, bewildered boy who had just been told the world was not, in fact, his personal playground, and that the rules had changed without his permission. They expected to find me weeping, or perhaps defiant and screaming, ready for a fight. They expected hysterics. They found me sitting calmly on the edge of my bed, my book resting in my lap. But I looked up at them, my expression placid, my gaze steady, perhaps even a little curious. I did not get up. I did not raise my voice. I held all the power in the room, simply by being still, by being quiet. I was the calm at the center of the storm they had created. What is the meaning of this? David demanded, waving the papers in his hand as if trying to ward off an evil spirit. His voice was trying for authority, for the booming tone he used with his subordinates, but it trembled with a raw, naked panic. This is insane. You signed my house away? Our future? My house, David, I corrected him softly. My voice was even, quiet, but it cut through their fury like a surgeon's scalpel. It was a simple statement of fact, and it held the weight of 40 years of truth. The one I paid the mortgage on, every single month for 35 years. The one I worked 42 years at a front desk to afford. A job that slowly sanded away my soul. My house. This is our home. Amelia shrieked, finally finding her voice again and stepping forward into the dim light of the basement. We live here. We've made plans. The home office. My wellness room. We've invested money here. Yes, I remember the plans, I said, my gaze unflinching as it met hers. One of them involved me living in here, in the cellar, like unwanted storage. You can't have it both ways, Amelia. You can't have the house and discard the owner in the same breath. You made it very clear what you think my place is. I was to be the unseen foundation. So I have taken you at your word. My place is with the foundation, and from here I control the entire house. David's face crumpled. The last vestiges of his manufactured anger dissolved into a desperate, pleading, childish panic. This was the reaction I had been expecting. He was never the architect of the cruelty, merely its willing, spineless accomplice. Now that the consequences had arrived at his own doorstep, his bravado vanished, revealing the terrified little boy underneath. Mom, please, he begged, his voice cracking, the papers trembling in his hand. You can't do this to us, to your own son, to your family. Where will we go? We just bought the new patio furniture. We have a dinner party planned with my boss for next week. This will ruin me. The sheer, breathtaking, monumental absurdity of his plea. The patio furniture, the dinner party, was almost comical. It was the cry of a man who saw no moral catastrophe in his actions, only a deeply inconvenient social one. His world was collapsing around him, and these were the pillars he was trying to save. He wasn't mourning the loss of a relationship. He was mourning the loss of his status. Those are not my concerns anymore, David, I said, and my voice was so cold, so utterly devoid of the maternal warmth he had taken for granted his entire life, that he physically recoiled. You made your choice when you stood by and let your wife sentence me to this room. You made your choice every time you took my money, my energy, my life force, and offered a hollow, meaningless thank you in return. You made your choice when you watched her mock the very essence of who I am, the one pure thing I had kept for myself, and you chuckled along with her. I didn't know what to say, he stammered, the pathetic, timeless excuse of a coward that withered and died in the cold, damp air between us. No, I said, and the diamond-hard ice in my voice made him flinch again. You knew exactly what to say. You could have said, stop. You could have said, that's my mother. You could have said, that's enough. You just didn't care enough to say it. You valued her approval more than you valued my dignity. You made a calculation, and you chose her. Ace. Amelia, seeing her husband's pathetic pleading was failing, surged forward again, her face ugly with a raw, unfiltered hate. You vindictive old witch, she spat, the words sharp and venomous. You will regret this. We will get a lawyer. We will fight this and we will take this house. We will prove you're incompetent. For the first time, I almost smiled. A real smile. Please do, I said, my voice laced with a calm amusement that infuriated her more than any shout could have. I would welcome it. Mr. Davies, my lawyer, is quite thorough. The documents are ironclad. The house was legally and irrevocably transferred 6 months before you ever concocted your plan to move in and take over. It belongs to a trust for Lily. You have no claim. Not a legal one, and certainly not a moral one. You are, as of this morning, merely tenants, and your lease has expired. I paused, letting the words sink in, then delivered the final, crushing, practical blow. The notification letters also state that, as the trustee, I have decided to change the locks in exactly 48 hours to secure the asset. I would suggest you start packing. The mention of the locks, the stark, 2-day, non-negotiable deadline, was the final nail in the coffin of their arrogance. It made it real. It made it immediate. Amelia looked as if I had physically struck her across the face. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a terrifying, wide-eyed, silent understanding of her new reality. They had no money for a new house. Their lifestyle, their status, their carefully curated image of success, it was all built on the foundation of this home, this asset I had provided. They had flown too close to the sun on wings of arrogance, and they were only now realizing those wings were made of wax I had painstakingly rendered, and I had just led them into the shade. David just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air on the deck of a boat. He was looking at me, but I don't think he was seeing the 70-year-old woman in the basement anymore. I think, for the very first time in his life, he was seeing the full, terrifying, crushing scope of the sacrifices I had made. He was seeing the ghost of my mother's pearls, the ghost of my retirement savings, the ghost of 40 years of my life, all standing in a silent, accusatory phalanx behind me in the dim, unforgiving light of the cellar. He sank down onto the bottom step of the stairs, a puppet with its strings cut. He put his head in his hands and made a sound that was half sob, half choked, ragged, gasp. Amelia stood frozen beside him, her world imploding in silence. Their empire of two, built on my silent surrender and fueled by their casual greed, had crumbled to dust in the space of 10 minutes. I picked up my book. I found my page. I smoothed the crease, and I started to read again. I left them there, huddled in the doorway of my tomb, to suffocate on the cold, bitter ashes of their own creation. The collapse was absolute. 3 months have passed. It is deep autumn now, and the air that drifts through the newly washed, open windows of my house is crisp and clean, and smells of wood smoke from a distant chimney and the sweet, earthy decay of fallen leaves. The silence in this house is different now. It is not the tense, waiting silence of a tomb or the exhausted, echoing silence of a battlefield. It is the peaceful, breathing, expansive silence of a sanctuary, a place of healing. David and Amelia are gone. They packed in a 2-day flurry of furious, panicked activity. Their departure was not a graceful or dignified retreat. It was a clumsy, angry, chaotic exodus, punctuated by slammed doors, muttered curses, and a final venomous glare from Amelia as their over-leveraged SUV, packed to the roof with the trappings of a life they could no longer afford, pulled out of my driveway for the last time. I watched them go from the living room window, feeling not a surge of triumph, not a gloating sense of victory, but a quiet, profound, and soul-deep sense of release. It was as if a breath I had been holding for 40 years had finally been let out. I have heard, through a mutual acquaintance who spoke in hushed, gossipy tones, that they are renting a small, cramped apartment across town, their lifestyle dramatically, humiliatingly curtailed. Their dinner parties are, for now, a thing of the past. David is reportedly struggling at work. I felt nothing at this news. It was like reading a weather report from a distant country. The day after they left, Lily came over. She walked into the house, dropped her heavy school bag by the door, and her first act was not to hug me, but to walk with a determined stride down to the basement. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the cold concrete corner where my bed had been, at the lonely light bulb, at the damp spot on the wall. I saw her young shoulders tense with an anger she felt on my behalf. Then she turned to me, her green eyes, so unlike her mother's, filled with a fierce protective light that was a balm to my old soul. "Never again, Grandma," she said, her voice low and firm. Never again. We spent that entire weekend performing a kind of exorcism. We aired out the house, cleansing it of the residue of their entitlement. We opened every window, even in the autumn chill, letting the clean, sharp air sweep through the rooms and carry away the last vestiges of Amelia's perfume and David's cowardice. We burned bundles of sage, a ritual Lily suggested, and its fragrant, cleansing smoke clung to the walls and chased out the last of the ghosts. The basement was scrubbed with bleach and hot water, and the cheap, garishly floral rug Amelia had thrown down was rolled up with a sense of grim satisfaction and put out with the trash. The spare room, the one Amelia had coveted for her wellness room, the room that had such terrible light, is now my studio. My beloved portfolio of botanical drawings is no longer hidden on a bottom shelf. The drawings are now pinned to a large corkboard that covers an entire wall, a vibrant, detailed tapestry of my reclaimed soul. The light in this room, as Amelia had correctly, if cruelly noted, is not the best. But I have found that the soft northern light is perfect for the detailed, close work I love. I sit here for hours, with my specialized inks and my watercolors, the clean, familiar scent of damp paper and earthy pigment, replacing the ghost of Amelia's perfume. I am working on a new series, a collection of paintings documenting the incredibly resilient mosses and lichens that grow on old stone walls. They are survivors. They are pioneers. They thrive where nothing else can. I understand them now, more than ever. My life has found a new rhythm, a quiet, gentle cadence that is dictated not by the needs of others, but by my own desires. I wake when I wish, not to the pre-dawn alarm of a workday or the demanding shouts of a hungry child, but to the slant of the morning sun across my bedroom floor. My own bedroom. I drink my coffee while it is still hot, sitting in my favorite armchair and reading a book, not just the headlines. I spend hours in my garden, not as a chore to be completed, but as a moving meditation. Lily joins me most afternoons after school. We don't talk much about her parents. We don't need to. The silence between us on that subject is a comfortable, shared understanding. Instead, we talk about her plans for college. She wants to study environmental law, to fight for the things that cannot speak for themselves, and about the proper way to divide dahlia tubers for their winter hibernation. Her hands, strong and capable, plunged into the rich soil of the garden I protected for her, are a promise of a healthier future, a different kind of lineage. She sees the garden not as a backdrop for her life, but as a living, breathing thing to be nurtured, a legacy. Last week, I received a letter. The envelope had David's familiar, sprawling handwriting on it. My first instinct was to tear it in half, unopened, and throw it in the compost. But curiosity, a gentler, more detached form of it now, won out. I slit the envelope open with the silver letter opener my colleagues had given me, one of the few things from that party I had kept. The letter was not angry. It was, in many ways, worse. It was pathetic. It was a rambling 10-page, self-pitying account of his struggles, his new smaller life, his wounded pride. It was filled with phrases like, "After all I've achieved," and "How could this happen to me? And you've put me in an impossible position." He never once mentioned the basement. He never once apologized. At the very end, in a sentence that was almost a bewildered afterthought, he wrote, "I just don't understand why you did it, Mom." I folded the letter and placed it on the corner of the small desk in my studio. For a full day, I considered a response. I thought of writing him a long, detailed letter, a treatise outlining every single sacrifice, every forgotten birthday, every casual slight, every moment of searing pain. I thought of explaining the difference between love and obligation, between a gift and an investment, between a mother and a resource. But then I realized, as I looked at my drawings on the wall, at the intricate, self-sufficient worlds I had created, I owed him no more explanations. My entire life had been an explanation, and he had refused to read it. My work was done. Instead, I took a small blank card of thick, creamy paper. I went to my desk, picked up a fine-nibbed pen filled with sepia ink, and I drew a single, perfect, intricate rendering of a sprig of hornwort, a humble, ancient, and incredibly resilient bryophyte, one of the first plants to ever conquer the land, to create soil from barren rock. Underneath it, I wrote a single sentence, my own declaration of independence. He did it so I could finally see myself. I mailed it to him without a return address. It was the last thing I ever intended to say to him. It was, finally, the end of my monologue. This evening, I sit in my quiet, peaceful living room. A cup of chamomile tea steams on the table beside me. The house is clean. It smells of beeswax and old books. The digital photo frame they gave me is gone, donated to a local charity. In its place on the mantelpiece stands a single, beautifully framed botanical illustration of a maidenhair fern. It is the one Lily said looked like it could breathe. For 40 years, I believed my value was measured by the depth of my sacrifice. I thought that to be a good mother, I had to be a ghost in my own life, an invisible, selfless force that existed only to propel others forward. I was wrong. True love is not self-erasure. True strength is not silent, uncomplaining endurance. It is the quiet, unshakable, cellular knowledge of your own worth. It is the courage to prune the branches that block your own sun, to tear out the invasive parasitic species that choke your roots, no matter how beautiful their flowers may seem. I spent a lifetime tending a garden for someone else. But now, in the glorious, golden autumn of my years, I have finally learned to cultivate my own. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I am not waiting for someone else to bring me flowers. I am growing my own. And they are magnificent.